God Wants You to Be an Atheist by Milron Shaw. Free audiobook read by M. Gilroy Sinclair. Available in 12 weekly chapters. The complete free audio text. Physical version available worldwide from Amazon. Why not have a copy of this available to hand to any religious callers who come to your door? Guaranteed to make them never come back again. Also, an ideal Christmas present for any religious relatives. God Wants You to Be an Atheist. Chapter 3. Seriously, get to the point. Why would God want us to give up on them? The vast majority of believers in a Christian/Jewish faith and others see the creation story in the book of Genesis as an allegory. These people see this story as an extended metaphor. This may need to be unpacked a little to make everything clear. If you believe in the literal truth of Genesis, I will also cover that further down. You may not have noticed, but there are actually two, not just one, creation stories in the book of Genesis. These both cover all of creation and are derived from two culturally different sources, which were combined into the text we see today. In Genesis chapter 1, the first version of the creation story, we see the big stuff, light and darkness, night and day, etc., which take place over 1 week, which, if you think about it, is odd, as the actual concept of days and nights doesn't come into existence until the end of this week. And the events didn't have a witness around to write them down. This logically implies that this is a story, at best, a simplified version of events and was made up by people who were working with a worldview that was worked out from observations and extrapolation of the world around them. We can forgive these people for inventing a story where the universe is created by a god, and this god created everything they can see, including themselves. After all, this is how science works. A person comes up with an idea which fits the observable information. And this is then accepted until the idea doesn't fit the observable information. Then another idea is used to replace it, and so on. From a practical point of view, this story was largely derived from an earlier Babylonian text, which was just taken as true, as there was nothing better available. This is chapter 1 of Genesis. However, chapter 2 is where things get really interesting. Chapter 2 of Genesis contains the Adam and Eve stories, and can only really be seen as an allegory, as some of the events take place without a witness, and their other events take place involving people who would not be able to write at all. This can be safely referred to as fiction. We can let this go and move on. A story that cannot be taken as literally true, as it contains a series of information that is derived from earlier religions. Let's look at the basics. Adam is created from dust by God in their own image. There's a lot to unpack there. The first question would be, why would the human race want to look like upgraded apes? Seems to be because this is the basic design of God themselves. This may seem flippant, but it is nothing when we look at Adam's wife. As an interesting side note, some traditions tell a slightly different version of the story of Eve's creation from the one in most Bibles. Eve is Adam's third wife. This is really going to come as a surprise to some, but there is a story that seems to have first been recorded about 200 years before the birth of Christ that needs to be examined, especially in connection with the current reactions to transgender people by certain groups. In all versions of the story, God created Adam in their own image, but in this version, Adam is first a hermaphrodite. The first person created is both male and female. Then God splits them apart into separate beings. Let that sink in. In some versions of the Bible, Adam and his first wife are the same gender and of the same flesh. God's first attempt to make a human is to make a person in their own image as either no gender or all genders. If the first attempt is one closest to God's true form, then God is all genders and none. God sees what they have done, and a decision is quickly made to split this creature into two. These two beings would have a specific gender from this point onwards. If you see this story as true and you take the Bible literally, you have no choice but to accept that God created the first transgender person and was logically transgender themselves. The story continues. Adam is repulsed by the person before him, a mirror of themselves, and this unnamed first wife is then sent to wander the earth alone and is never heard from again. God doesn't give up, and they make wife number 2, Lilith. Now Lilith is an interesting character. She is as clever as Adam. She is beautiful and is equal in every way. This equality seems to really annoy Adam. Adam seems to be the first idiot/misogynist. And they argue, and she gives up and leaves. Once she leaves the Garden of Eden, she ends up at the Red Sea, where the devil is waiting for her, and they have children together. These children are demons who haunt the world from this day onwards. Adam then becomes quite grumpy at being left alone, and complains to God. God promptly dispatches 3 angels to find her, which is odd, as they are supposed to be omnipotent, and they should already know of her location. When the angels find Lilith, she is happy and living with her family. These children are interesting, as they predate Cain and Abel. They are also supposed to be half human and half devil. These half demons are supposed to haunt humanity for all eternity, unless you happen to have your own special amulet. Lilith appears later in the Bible as a wandering spirit/demon herself. At this point, God decides to start again, 3rd time lucky. God puts Adam to sleep, so he can't see what's going on, takes out a rib and makes Eve from this, and the story goes on as we traditionally know it. They are happy. God starts behaving like a parent and says, "Don't go near the tree of knowledge." There is a serpent who tempts Eve with fruit of the tree, never ever called an apple in the actual book. And then God, apparently, gets angry and the whole family is expelled from Eden, off to the land of Nod, which is east of Eden. Obviously, there are some issues with Adam and Eve being the first humans, especially when it comes to the fact that they had 2 sons, and there are no women mentioned, and yet the human race does not die out due to a lack of females. Other issues include, if God created everything, why bother with the tree at all? If God created everything, then they also created the serpent. Then God is working through the serpent, and they are behind the whole event. And so on, and so on. Which brings us to my core argument. This story is obviously just that, a story. The tale at the core of Genesis is an allegory for a parent showing their child that the world is a harsh place, and that the more they learn, the harder life will become. In this allegory, God is a parent. And here's where the seed of the idea comes from. Any good parent wants to prepare their child for the world and let them go into that world so they can stand on their own 2 feet. To help a child get to a point in their life when they can do without them. God clearly wants you to be a grown-up. God wants you to take responsibility for your actions, to be a good person, not because you will go to heaven or hell, as discussed in the last chapter. They want you to be good because it's the right thing to do. There is another old story, and in this story, set at the end of time, where God is put on trial by the human race. The prosecution lists all of the awful things that have happened in history. The list is long, and full of sadness and injustice. At the end of the list, the prosecution takes a deep breath and asks, "How did you allow this to happen?" And from the echoing void comes back, "How did you allow this to happen?" If you believe that we, as humans, are children of God, we not only have free will, but we are required to use that free will. As children, we need to grow up and take responsibility for all our actions, and get to a point where we don't need our parents. This is why God wants you to be an atheist. God wants us to be so good that we don't need them. We don't need religion, more about that later, and all we need is ourselves working together to make life better here on earth. As a race, humans need to stop hoping that some magical, invisible force will help us out in our moments of despair, and we need to help ourselves. God doesn't want us together to praise their mythical power in the hope that we will get a share in its use. If God is real, then what they want is for us to help each other. To quote Bill and Ted, "Be excellent to each other, not because there's a reward awaiting us, but because it's the right thing to do. Literally create a heaven on earth. We should not wait for things to get better, to hope for a rapture or an afterlife. We need to make things better now, together." If you need more explanations, I will try a different approach. If you believe in the literal truth of Genesis, and that God created humans and was a sort of benevolent gardener, in the Garden of Eden, as they are so often portrayed, this is simple. God creates humans to go out into the world, and God is our ultimate parent. And the argument still stands. The tree of knowledge is just that. We are self-aware, and we can now see the world in sharp focus, and then make decisions for ourselves. In the book, God has created everything, including the snake and the tree, which suggests that Eve eats the apple of knowledge as part of an ineffable plan. Now the apple is either a literal apple from the tree that was out of bounds for no reason, or it was a metaphor for growing up and learning about the nature of the world. If the second one is true, this leads more weight to my central argument. God created everything, including the tree and the snake. This then sets in motion where the humans he has created follow a set course of actions, which means they end up leaving the blissful state of Eden and going out into the cold, dark world with knowledge of pain. If we can return to the idea of God being a parent, then we need to be clear that all parents want their children to thrive and survive, to grow to a point where they do not need their parents anymore, where children are happy and self-sufficient enough to take care of themselves. This is why God wants you to stop believing in them. God is the parent. Eden is an allegory for childhood. The tree of knowledge is an allegory for becoming self-aware as you grow up, and leaving Eden is an allegory for growing up and having to fend for yourself. God just wants you to take responsibility and make things better in this world. Once you have that basic idea, then we can begin to explore the larger truth, which moves to a better and brighter life without the yoke of religion.